Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take on those huge, complex historical figures and, really distill their stories into something sharp and unforgettable.
And today, we are immersing ourselves in the life of an absolute American titan, Frederick Douglass.
Right. And our mission here is to go way beyond the summary you got in high school. We want to synthesize the foundational knowledge, of course, but more than that, we want to dig into the ideological shifts.
Exactly, the moments where he changed his mind, because that's where you really see the engine for change, both for him and for the nation.
And we're starting with a hook that, it almost sounds unbelievable. When Douglass first started speaking in the North, his oratory was so powerful, so refined,
That people didn't believe him. Northern audiences literally refused to believe such an eloquent man could have ever been a slave. They thought he had to be an imposter.
Just think about that for a second. The system was designed to crush the human intellect, and here's a man whose intellect is so strong, it breaks their entire perception of that system.
So what does he do? He writes his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. It was basically a challenge to the entire country, daring them to question the facts of his life.
An incredible act of bravery. But there's another piece to this that's just as startling. He was, by actual count, the most photographed American of the 19th century.
The most. More than Lincoln, more than Grant. He understood media and image in a way that was decades ahead of his time. He was using photography to fight racist caricatures before anyone else even knew that was the game.
It's just an immediate sign that he was always thinking strategically, controlling the narrative with the pen and with the camera. So let's unpack how that journey even began.
Okay, so we start in Talbot County, Maryland. He was born into slavery around February 1818. Now, the date itself is uncertain, and slave people's birthdays were almost never recorded.
But he chose one for himself later, right?
He did. He chose February 14th because he had this faint memory of his mother, Harriet Bailey, calling him her little Valentine. It's this small, powerful act of self-determination.
And right from birth, the cruelty of the system is just absolute. He was separated from his mother almost immediately.
Standard practice. It was designed to break those family bonds, to stop resistance before it could even start.
Yeah.
He was raised for a time by his grandmother, Betsy Bailey. His father, he later stated, was a white man, most likely his master.
Which was a common and brutal reality of slavery.
It was. But what's fascinating is how he framed it. In his later works, he attributes his intelligence, his love of letters, not to his white father, but to what he called the native genius of his black mother.
He's claiming his own identity, taking ownership of his intellect from the very beginning.
But those earliest memories are of just utter hardship. He talks about sleeping on a cold, dirt floor.
And the detail about the meal bag.
It's visceral. To stay warm, he'd crawl headfirst into a coarse meal sack and sleep with his feet by the fire. He was constantly hungry. This is the baseline we're starting from.
And the transformation, that very first spark, happens when he's sent away from the plantation to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld.
This move is everything. Baltimore is a different world. And Sophia Auld, at first, shows him a kindness he's never known. She starts teaching him the alphabet.
A simple, humane act.
But it doesn't last. Her husband, Hugh, finds out, and he is furious. He forbids her from teaching Douglass another word.
And Hugh Auld's reasoning for this becomes what Douglass calls the most important lesson of his life.
He calls it the first decidedly anti-slavery lecture he ever heard. Hugh Auld says that if you teach a slave to read, it'll spoil him. It'll make him unhappy, make him want freedom.
And for Douglass, it's like a lightning bolt.
It's a roadmap. It gives him this profound, immediate clarity. If that's the thing that unfits a child to be a slave, then knowledge is the direct pathway from slavery to freedom.
So the master's own logic becomes his instruction manual.
Exactly. So now he knows why he has to learn, and he starts this secret, clandestine education. Sophia, now terrified of her husband, starts hiding her books from him.
So how does he do it? How does he continue to learn?
He becomes, as you said, sort of an intellectual thief. He trades bits of bread with poor white neighborhood kids for reading lessons. He studies the letters on timber in the shipyards. It's this relentless, active pursuit of knowledge.
And this quest leads him to a book that changes everything for him.
At about age 12, he gets his hands on a copy of the Columbian Orator. It's an anthology of speeches, essays, dialogues.
And it does more than just teach him words, right?
Oh, much more. It teaches him the philosophy of freedom. It has these powerful dialogues, like one where a slave logically argues his master into freeing him. It gave him the language, the rhetorical structure, to articulate the injustice he felt in his bones.
He's building the intellectual ammunition he'll need later.
Precisely. But before he can use it, he has to survive a trial by fire, literally.
Right.
He's deemed too unruly and is sent back to the countryside to be leased to a man named Edward Covey.
And Covey had a reputation.
A terrible one. He was known as a slave breaker. His entire job was to crush the spirit of enslaved people like Douglas, and for a while it worked. Douglas said the beatings were so constant, so soul-crushing, that he was transformed from a man into a brute.
This is the absolute lowest point of his life.
It is. And it's right here, at this nadir, that the turning point happens. One day, Covey comes to whip him, and Douglas, who's about 16 years old, decides he's had enough.
He fights back.
He fights back. For nearly 2 hours, they're locked in this physical struggle, and Douglas wins. Covey is so humiliated that he never lays a hand on him again.
And the way Douglas writes about this moment it's incredible. It's not just a fight.
It's a spiritual rebirth. He says in his narrative, "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man." That fight was him reclaiming his own soul. He realized that the system depended on his consent to be beaten, and by refusing, he broke the psychological chain.
So that internal freedom, that sense of manhood, comes long before his actual physical escape.
It had to. That was the foundation for everything that came next. After the Covey ordeal, he's eventually sent back to Baltimore, and it's there he meets Anna Murray.
She's a free black woman, and she is absolutely central to his escape.
Instrumental. She provides moral support, but also the practical means. She gives him her life savings to fund the escape, and she gets him a sailor's uniform.
Why a sailor's uniform?
Because sailors carried identification papers that gave them a certain freedom of movement. She helped him get his hands on papers from a free black seaman. It was an incredibly risky plan for both of them.
And on September 3rd, 1838, he puts the plan into action.
He gets on a northbound train in Baltimore. In disguise. The whole journey to New York City took less than 24 hours, but can you imagine the terror of every single moment on that train?
Every glance from a conductor, every question could have been the end.
He said when he arrived in New York, he felt like he'd escaped from a den of hungry lions. Anna joins him a little over a week later. They get married, and they realize they need to get out of the city. It's not safe.
So they head north to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a whaling town and a hub for the abolitionist movement.
Right. And it's there that he sheds his old identity. They were using the surname Johnson, but it was too common. A local black leader named Nathan Johnson, who was reading Walter Scott's poem, The Lady at the Lake, suggested the name Douglas from one of the characters.
A new name from a work of literature. It's fitting.
It's a complete break. And in New Bedford, he finds his community and eventually his platform. He joins the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and becomes a licensed preacher.
So he's honing those incredible oratorical skills in the black church.
Yes, that was his training ground. It's where he develops that cadence, that power, that command of language that would make him famous.
And his debut on the public stage is almost accidental, isn't it?
It is. In 1841, he goes to an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket. He's just there to listen, but someone convinces him to get up and say a few words about his experience.
And he just stuns the audience.
Completely stuns them. Here's this young man speaking with a power and an eloquence that rivaled the most educated white statesman. But he's telling this raw, authentic story of bondage. It was a combination they had never seen before. That one speech launched his career as a lecturer.
Which brings us right back to that paradox we started with. His very eloquence made people doubt his story.
Exactly. And his activism wasn't just on the stage. He's immediately involved in direct action protests. In 1841, he refuses to sit in the segregated train car in Massachusetts and gets physically thrown off the train. He's fighting segregation decades before the civil rights movement.
So he's always understood that the fight had to be on multiple fronts.
And it was always dangerous. In 1843, during a lecture tour in Indiana, he's attacked by a pro-slavery mob. They beat him so severely that his hand is broken.
And it never healed properly, did it?
Never. For the rest of his life, every time he picked up a pen to write or raised his hand to speak, he had this physical reminder of what it cost to agitate for freedom.
So his fame is growing, but so is the disbelief and the danger. This leads directly to him putting his story down on paper.
Right. He has to. In 1845, he published his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And he doesn't hold back. He names the people, the places, the dates.
And the book is a sensation.
An absolute phenomenon. It sells 11,000 copies in the U.S. in just 3 years, which was a massive number back then, and it gets translated into French and Dutch, making him an international figure overnight.
But by telling the truth so explicitly, he puts himself in enormous danger.
A huge amount of danger. He's now publicly admitted he's the fugitive property of Hugh Auld. His friends basically tell him, you have to leave the country now.
So he goes on a 2-year tour of Ireland and Great Britain, and this trip is profoundly transformative for him.
It really is. He arrives in Ireland right at the start of the Great Famine, and he's shocked by the poverty he sees. But at the same time, he experiences a kind of racial freedom he's never known.
What did that feel like for him?
He wrote about it so powerfully. The simple act of sitting next to a white person in a carriage, or dining at the same table in a hotel. He said he could finally breathe. He wrote, "Lo, the chattel becomes a man."
And this experience broadens his entire view of human rights.
It solidifies it. He connects the suffering of the Irish poor with the suffering of the American slave and concludes that the cause of humanity is one the world over. His focus expands from just abolition to universal human dignity.
And while he's in Britain, his supporters there actually, they buy his freedom.
They do. A group of British abolitionists raise the money and legally purchase his manumission from Thomas Auld. So in 1847, he returns to the U.S. not as a fugitive, but as a legally free man.
Which must have given him a whole new level of confidence and security to continue his work.
And he immediately uses that momentum. He takes the funds raised on his tour and starts his own newspaper in Rochester, New York, called the North Star.
This is a huge step, and it marks a major ideological break for him, doesn't it?
It's the most significant of his life, a break with his mentor, William Lloyd Garrison.
Okay, so what was the disagreement about?
It was about the U.S. Constitution. Garrison and his followers believed the Constitution was a fundamentally pro-slavery document, because of the 3/5 clause, the fugitive slave clause. Their position was no union with slaveholders. They wanted to dissolve the country.
And Douglas initially agreed with that.
He did. But around this time, through his own study, he starts to see it differently. He comes to believe the Constitution could be interpreted as an anti-slavery document.
How does he make that argument? I mean, the pro-slavery clauses are right there in the text.
His argument was clever. He pointed out that the words slave and slavery are never actually used in the Constitution. It uses euphemisms. He argued that if the founders intended to protect it forever, why were they ashamed to name it?
So he's looking at the spirit of the document, the language of the preamble, we the people, and saying, this can be used for liberty.
Precisely. He saw it as a glorious liberty document that could be wielded as a weapon against slavery, not an obstacle to be destroyed. This was a massive shift from moral condemnation to political pragmatism.
And that changed his view on dissolving the Union.
Completely. He argued that dissolving the Union would be a disaster. It would just leave the enslaved population completely at the mercy of the South, with no federal pressure or oversight. His view was, you don't burn the house down, you stay, and you fight to evict the thieves.
And that principle of engagement, of fighting from within, really defines the rest of his career. It extends beyond abolition, too. He was a fierce advocate for women's rights.
A dedicated champion. In 1848, he was the only African-American to attend the first Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls,
where Elizabeth Cady Stanton introduced this, at the time, really radical idea of women's suffrage.
So radical that many of the women there thought it was too much, that it would make them all look ridiculous. And it was Douglas who stood up and gave this passionate speech in favor of it. He's the one who swayed the vote. He said he couldn't accept the right to vote as a black man if women were denied that same right.
That's an incredible moment of solidarity, but that alliance was.
Yeah.
It was tested later on, after the Civil War.
It was. The debate over the 15th Amendment, which gave the vote to black men but not to women, created a really painful split between him and leaders like Stanton and Susan B. Anthony.
They argued for universal suffrage, for everyone at once.
Right, and Douglas argued that while he still believed in women's suffrage, the political reality was that tying the two causes together would mean neither would pass. For him, the vote for black men who were facing incredible violence in the South was a matter of immediate life and death.
A matter of survival.
It was a brutal political calculation. He chose what he saw as the most urgent priority, and it caused a deep rift with his longtime allies.
And speaking of difficult alliances, this brings us to John Brown.
The ultimate moral and strategic dilemma for Douglas. He met Brown and admired his passion, but he fundamentally disagreed with his methods.
They had a secret meeting right before the raid on Harper's Ferry, didn't they?
They did, in an old stone quarry. Brown laid out his whole plan to seize the federal armory and spark this massive slave uprising.
And what did Douglas think?
He thought it was a suicide mission. He pleaded with Brown not to do it. Douglas believed in using the political system, the constitutional arguments he had developed. Brown believed only violence would work.
There's that incredible and heartbreaking anecdote about Shields Green.
Yeah. Douglas had brought Shields Green, a fugitive slave he was helping, to the meeting. After Douglas told Brown he wouldn't join, he turned to Green to leave. And Green just said, "I believe I'll go with the old man." And he went with Brown to Harper's Ferry, and he was killed.
It just shows the profound division in the movement at that moment.
It does. And when the raid failed, a warrant was issued for Douglas's arrest as an accomplice. He had to flee the country again, first to Canada, then England, until things cooled down.
Okay, so when the Civil War finally does break out in 1861, Douglas has a very clear idea of what the war needs to be about.
Absolutely. He argued from day one that this could not just be a war to preserve the Union. It had to be a war to end slavery. And critically, he insisted that African Americans should be allowed to fight for their own freedom.
He saw enlistment as a claim to citizenship.
The ultimate claim. He published that famous broadside, Men of Color to Arms, and worked as a recruiter.
And this was personal for him. His own sons enlisted.
Two of his sons, Charles and Lewis, were among the first to join the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, the famous regiment from the movie Glory. He put his own family on the line.
His influence became so great that he actually had meetings with President Lincoln.
Two of them. He went right to the White House to argue for equal pay for black soldiers and to demand protection for black prisoners of war who were being executed by the Confederacy.
He's negotiating policy at the highest level of government.
And in their second meeting, Lincoln actually asks Douglas for his help in devising a plan to get more enslaved people to escape to Union lines. It shows you the level of respect and trust that had developed between them.
After the war, with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the constitutional victory he'd been fighting for seems to have been won.
It did. And he transitions into the role of a statesman. He gets a number of federal appointments. He's made president of the Freedmen's Savings Bank.
Which didn't end well.
No, it was a disaster. The bank was already corrupt and mismanaged by its white directors before he got there, and it collapsed, wiping out the savings of thousands of black families. It was a painful lesson for him.
But he continues to rise. He's appointed U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia.
The first person of color to hold that post. A huge symbolic and practical victory.
But even in these moments of triumph, he never stopped being a critic. You see this so clearly in his speech at the unveiling of the Emancipation Memorial in 1876.
It's one of his greatest speeches. In front of the president and Congress, he gives this incredibly complex and honest assessment of Lincoln. He calls him the white man's president, acknowledging that Lincoln's first priority was always the Union, not the slave.
That is a brave thing to say at that moment.
Incredibly brave. But then he balances it. He says that, measured against the sentiment of the country at the time, Lincoln was actually swift, zealous, radical, and determined. He's teaching the nation how to hold two complex truths at the same time.
And he wasn't just critical of Lincoln's legacy, he was critical of the statue itself.
Immediately. The statue shows Lincoln standing over a kneeling, half-clothed black man. Douglas wrote a letter right after the ceremony saying this was wrong. The black man, he said, should be shown erect on his feet like a man. He was demanding visual equality, not just legal equality.
That idea of universal dignity also informed his views on immigration, which were radical for the time.
Absolutely. This was during a period of intense anti-Chinese racism, and Douglas gave a speech called Our Composite Nationality, where he fiercely defended Chinese immigration, their right to citizenship, everything.
Why was that so important to him?
Because for him, the principle of America wasn't about race or origin. It was about liberty. He argued that the nation's strength was in its diversity. He believed fighting for black rights meant you had to fight for everyone's rights.
And as we move into his final years, his personal life continues to challenge conventions. After his first wife, Anna, dies, he remarries.
He marries Helen Pitts, a white suffragist who was about 20 years younger than him, and it causes an absolute firestorm from white society, from black society, even from his own children.
How did he handle the criticism?
With his brilliant cutting wit. He famously said that his first wife was the color of his mother and his second wife was the color of his father, just completely disarming the critics by stating the plain truth of his own mixed heritage.
He also, late in life, visited his former enslaver Thomas Auld on his deathbed.
Another controversial move. But for Douglas, it seems to have been about achieving a kind of personal closure, moving beyond the hatred that he felt was just as enslaving.
And his public service continued. He was appointed as the U.S. Minister to Haiti.
But he resigned when he realized the U.S. government was just trying to use him to pressure Haiti into giving up territory for a naval base. He refused to be a party to American imperialism against another black republic. His integrity was absolute.
And all through these final years, living at his home, Cedar Hill in Washington, D.C., he's still thinking about his image.
We have to circle back to the photography. He knew exactly what he was doing.
So the stern, unsmiling look in every single portrait, that was intentional.
Completely intentional. He was fighting the racist caricature of the happy, smiling minstrel slave. He used the truth of the photograph to present himself as a serious, dignified, intelligent citizen. That direct, unsmiling gaze was a political statement. It was a demand for respect.
On February 20th, 1895, he attended a meeting of the National Council of Women.
He was welcomed as a hero. He received a standing ovation. He went home that evening and died of a sudden heart attack.
His last piece of advice given to a young black man who asked him what to do has become his most famous quote.
It's the perfect summary of his entire life's work. 3 simple words.
Agitate, agitate, agitate.
So when you look back, the scope of his journey is just staggering.
Yeah.
From a child in a meal bag to arguably the most important intellectual and political figure of his century.
Right. He gives us the blueprint. He masters literacy to achieve freedom. He reshapes the constitutional debate. He connects the struggles for abolition, women's rights, immigrant rights.
He really creates the model for strategic civil rights activism that people would follow for the next 100 years.
So as we wrap up, what's the big lesson here? What does Douglas's lifelong fight for universal rights challenge us with today?
I think the lesson is twofold. First, that all external change starts with an internal transformation, that decision to become a man, not a slave. But second, his vision was so expansive. It wasn't just about one group. His idea of a composite nationality asks us a really hard question. Are we willing to fight as hard for the rights of others as we are for our own?
A question that is as relevant now as it was then. To really get the full power of his voice, we can't recommend his autobiographies enough. Start with the narrative, but then move on to My Bondage and My Freedom. They are essential American texts.
They're a call to action, a call to agitate.
And that concludes our deep dive into the life of Frederick Douglass. We'll see you next time.